Ambassador Zekthor had seen many species in his 3 centuries of diplomatic service, but humans always made him uncomfortable. They were too small, too fragile, too emotional. Their planet Earth was a death world by galactic standards. Yet somehow they had not only survived but thrived in conditions that would kill most civilized beings within hours. Standing in the observation deck of the neutral station orbiting Kepler 442b, Zekthor watched the human delegation prepare for what everyone knew would be a massacre. The Vorthak Empire had sent their most elite death squads to this remote world, claiming the humans had violated territorial agreements. It was a lie, of course. The Vorthak simply wanted the rare crystalline deposits beneath the planet's surface. The human team consisted of only 12 individuals. 12 against 300. Vorthak warriors equipped with the finest military technology in the galaxy. Zekthor's forearms trembled slightly as he adjusted his diplomatic robes. He had tried to convince the Galactic Council to intervene, but the politics were too complicated. Humanity was still considered a junior species despite their recent admission to the Council. Captain Sarah Chen, the human mission leader, had requested a private meeting with him earlier that morning. Zekthor remembered how she had looked him directly in his primary eyes, something that most species found deeply unsettling about humans. They always made eye contact as if they were trying to see into your very soul. "Ambassador," she had said in that strange musical language of theirs, "I know what you're thinking. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and probably going to die down there." She had smiled then, an expression that showed her teeth in what humans called humor, but what most aliens interpreted as a threat display. "But here's the thing about humans you might not know yet. We're really, really good at not dying when we're supposed to." Zekthor had served as a diplomatic observer in 17 conflicts across the galaxy. He had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, watched entire species choose extinction over surrender. But something about the way Captain Chen spoke, the absolute certainty in her voice, had given him pause. There was no bravado, no false courage, just a simple statement of fact that felt heavier than a neutron star. Now, watching the human dropship descend through the planet's turbulent atmosphere, Zekthor found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Vorthak had already established a perimeter around the mining facility, their energy shields glowing like purple suns across the barren landscape. Their weapons could punch through the hull of a battlecruiser. Their armor could withstand direct hits from plasma cannons. The human ship was a modified cargo hauler. It had no shields, no heavy weapons, and according to the technical specifications should have been scrapped 50 years ago. As it touched down in a cloud of dust and steam, Zekthor wondered if he was about to witness the shortest military engagement in galactic history. The cargo bay doors opened, with a mechanical whine that could be heard even through the station's audio pickups. What emerged made Zekthor's respiratory slits flutter in confusion. The humans weren't wearing power armor or carrying energy weapons. They wore simple fabric uniforms and carried what appeared to be primitive kinetic weapons. Projectile throwers, chemical explosives, technology that most civilizations had abandoned millennia ago. Captain Chen was the first to step onto the planet's surface. She raised something to her lips, a small metal object, and began making noise. It took Zekthor a moment to realize she was whistling. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling like the songs his own people sang for their dead. Behind her, the other humans began to move with a coordination that spoke of years of training together. The Vorthak commander's voice crackled across the communication channels, demanding immediate surrender. The translation matrix struggled with the aggressive harmonics of the Vorthak language, but the meaning was clear: submit or face annihilation. Captain Chen's response was delivered in perfect Vorthak, her pronunciation flawless despite the fact that human vocal cords should have been incapable of producing those sounds. "Negative, Commander. This world is under human protection. You have 30 minutes to withdraw your forces." The silence that followed was deafening. Zekthor's species had a saying, "Only the dead make such promises." But as he watched the 12 humans spread out across the landing zone, moving with the fluid precision of apex predators, he began to understand that perhaps the saying was wrong. Perhaps it was the living who made such promises and meant them. The Vorthak commander's laughter boomed across the frequencies, a sound like grinding metal that made Zekthor's scales itch. 12 primitives against my legion? Your species' arrogance will be your extinction." Captain Chen had stopped whistling. She was smiling again, And this time Zekthor understood exactly why other species found that expression so disturbing. It wasn't humor. It wasn't aggression. It was anticipation. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying across the barren landscape with impossible clarity. "You're about to learn why humans are the only species to have fought wars on a death world for 10,000 years and considered it good practice." The Vorthak attack began 30 seconds later. The first Vorthak energy barrage lit up the sky like an artificial aurora. Zekthor watched in horror as purple death rained down on the human positions, each blast carrying enough energy to vaporize a small building. The targeting computers showed perfect accuracy, direct hits on all 12 human positions. When the light faded and the dust settled, the humans were gone. Commander Velthar's triumphant roar echoed across the communication channels, but it died in his throat as his sensors began reporting impossible readings. No bodies, no debris, no thermal signatures indicating vaporized organic matter. The humans had simply vanished. Zekthor's own instruments were equally baffled. His diplomatic vessel's sensors were civilian-grade but still sophisticated enough to track a falling leaf in a hurricane. Yet somehow 12 human beings had disappeared without leaving so much as a footprint in the scorched earth. The first sign that something was wrong came from Patrol Squad 7 on the eastern perimeter. Their leader, Sub-Commander Krex, had been in the middle of reporting all clear when his transmission cut to static. Then Squad 12 went silent. Then Squad 3, report. Commander Velthar's voice cracked like a whip across the frequencies. "All units, report status immediately." The responses came in a chaos of overlapping voices, each more confused than the last. Squads were going dark one by one. Their last transmissions a mixture of weapons fire and what the translation matrix could only render as screaming. But not the screams of the dying. The screams of the terrified Zekthor found himself gripping the observation rail with all four hands. In his 3 centuries of diplomatic service, he had never seen Vorthak warriors afraid. They were genetically engineered for aggression, their nervous systems modified to eliminate fear responses. Yet the voices coming through the communications array spoke of pure primal terror. "Squad 9 to command." The voice was high-pitched, desperate. "Something's in the rocks with us. It's moving through the shadows and we can't lock onto it. Thermal shows nothing but we can hear it breathing and oh gods, it's right behind me and—" Silence. Commander Velthar's breathing was audible now. The deep, harsh rhythm of a Vorthak under stress. "All units fall back to secondary positions. Activate area denial weapons. If there's something hiding in those rocks, we'll burn it out." The orbital bombardment began 5 minutes later. Velthar's flagship opened up with its primary weapons array, turning the entire eastern slope into a sea of molten glass. No living thing could survive such an assault. The temperature readings showed surface conditions hot enough to melt steel. Yet 30 seconds after the bombardment ended, Squad 15 reported contact with hostile unknowns moving through the superheated wasteland. Moving fast, moving with purpose. Zekthor pulled up his personal files on human physiology, searching for some explanation. Humans were warm-blooded mammals from a high-gravity world. They should have been cooked alive in those temperatures. Their primitive equipment should have melted. Their exposed skin should have been seared from their bones. But there they were, visible now on the thermal scopes as cool blue shapes moving through the red-hot hellscape like ghosts made of ice. They weren't just surviving the heat. They were using it as cover. The humans had split into 3 groups of 4, each team moving with the coordination of a pack predator. They flowed across the battlefield like water, always taking the path of least resistance, always striking where the enemy was weakest. When the Vorthak formed defensive positions, the humans simply disappeared. When the Vorthak spread out to search, the humans materialized behind them. Squad after squad reported the same impossible encounters. Warriors would be standing guard one moment and found dead the next, their throats cut with primitive blades. Entire patrols would vanish during routine sweeps, leaving only scattered equipment and pools of purple blood. Sentries posted in elevated positions with perfect sight lines would simply stop responding. Their bodies discovered hours later with single projectile wounds through their heavily armored skulls. How? Commander Velthar's voice was barely a whisper now. How are they doing this? Captain Chen's voice came through the communication array like the answer to a prayer no one wanted to make. Commander, your warriors are very impressive. Fast, strong, well-equipped. But you've made one critical error in your tactical assessment. What error? Velthar snarled, though the aggression sounded forced now. You assumed this was a battle, Chen replied, and Zekthor could hear the smile in her voice. This isn't a battle, Commander. This is a hunt, and we're not the prey. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical attacks. The Vorthak had been taught to fear nothing, but fear was exactly what they were experiencing now. Not fear of death, which they had been conditioned to ignore, but fear of the unknown, fear of an enemy that seemed to exist outside the laws of physics and military science. Zekthor watched the tactical display as another squad went dark, their position markers changing from green to red to nothing at all. The Vorthak force was being systematically dismantled by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't track, and couldn't understand. The most disturbing part was how quiet it all was. No explosions, no energy weapon discharges, no sounds of conventional warfare. Just the steady, methodical elimination of one of the galaxy's most feared military forces by 12 humans with primitive weapons and impossible skills. By the time the first hour had passed, Commander Velthar had lost a third of his force, and the humans were just getting started. Zekthor had to steady himself against the observation console as another wave of impossible readings flooded his sensors. The humans had done something that violated every principle of military tactics he had ever learned. They had split up even further. Now there were 12 individual human signatures scattered across a battlefield that stretched for 50 kilometers. 12 separate hunters stalking an army of over 200 remaining Vorthak warriors. The tactical computers kept displaying error messages, unable to process a scenario where a single soldier would willingly face odds of 17-1. But the humans weren't just facing those odds. They were thriving in them. Sergeant Mike Torres had somehow infiltrated the Vorthak command bunker. Zekthor watched in fascination as the human moved through corridors filled with motion sensors, pressure plates, and automated defense systems. The man seemed to know exactly where each detection grid overlapped, precisely when the automated turrets would cycle through their scanning patterns. The Vorthak had built their bunker according to the finest military engineering principles in the galaxy. Every angle of approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Every entrance was monitored by redundant sensor arrays. The entire structure was a killing ground designed to stop an assault by a full battalion. Torres entered through the ventilation system. Zekthor's people had a concept they called the impossible possible, referring to events that should not occur but somehow did anyway. Watching a human being navigate through a ventilation shaft that was barely wide enough for a maintenance drone while carrying weapons and equipment should have been impossible. The thermal differential alone should have triggered alerts. The weight distribution should have caused structural failure. Instead, Torres moved through the bunker's circulatory system like a virus in a bloodstream, completely undetected. When he finally emerged, it was directly behind the Vorthak communications officer. The man's throat was cut before he could cry out, his claws still reaching for the alarm button. Meanwhile, on the eastern perimeter, Corporal Lisa Zhang had turned an entire Vorthak patrol against itself. She had somehow managed to mimic their communication frequencies, sending false orders that directed squads into overlapping kill zones. The Vorthak warriors, conditioned to follow orders without question, were literally shooting each other while she watched from a concealed position 300 meters away. The most disturbing display was happening in the southern sector, where Private First Class David Kim had turned psychological warfare into an art form. He wasn't killing the Vorthak warriors he encountered. He was leaving them alive but traumatized, spreading stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling. Warriors reported being stalked by an invisible demon that could appear behind them without warning. Others claimed to have been touched by ghostly hands that left no trace but somehow conveyed absolute certainty of impending death. Entire squads were calling in false alarms, shooting at shadows, and requesting immediate extraction from a battlefield they no longer understood. Commander Velthar's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. All units converge on the mining facility. Defensive perimeter, maximum overlapping coverage. If these humans want to play games in the shadows, we'll force them into the light. It was a sound tactical decision. The mining facility was open ground with excellent sightlines and no cover within a kilometer radius. The Vorthak could establish a fortress position and force the humans to attack across open terrain. It should have been a textbook example of how to neutralize a stealth advantage. Captain Chen's response came 30 seconds later. Acknowledged, Commander. Thank you for making this easier. Zekthor's confusion deepened as he watched the human teams begin moving toward the mining facility. They weren't approaching stealthily or attempting to find cover. They were walking directly across the open ground in plain sight, their primitive weapons held casually in their hands. The Vorthak opened fire when the humans were still 800 meters away. The energy barrage was continuous and overwhelming, turning the air itself into a plasma storm. Nothing could survive in that killing field. Nothing. The humans began to run. What Zekthor witnessed next would haunt his dreams for the rest of his long life. The humans didn't just move fast. They moved with a precision and coordination that seemed to bend the laws of physics around them. They dodged energy beams that moved at the speed of light by anticipating where the gunners would aim. They used the terrain features that didn't exist, somehow finding cover in perfectly flat ground. But most impossibly of all, they were enjoying themselves. Zekthor could hear their voices over the communication frequencies they had somehow hijacked. They were laughing, not the desperate laughter of those facing death, but the pure joy of experts practicing their craft. They called out encouragement to each other, made jokes about the Vorthak's aim, and critiqued each other's technique like athletes competing in a friendly game. Nice dodge, Sarah. You're getting better at the impossible stuff. Thanks, Mike. Your turn, watch this. Show off. Lisa, you seeing this? I'm a little busy here, guys. Can we focus on not dying for like 5 more minutes? The casual conversation between teammates in the middle of what should have been a massacre was more demoralizing than any weapon. The Vorthak warriors began to understand that they weren't fighting desperate survivors. They were fighting predators who considered this level of danger to be recreational activity. The humans reached the mining facility perimeter in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. During that time, they had crossed 800 meters of open ground under continuous heavy fire from over 200 enemy weapons. None of them had been hit. Not once. Commander Velthar's voice cracked as he gave his next order. Fall back to the secondary perimeter. All units, fall back now! But Captain Chen was already inside the facility, and her voice carried the weight of inevitability. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Commander. You've made your choice. Now you get to live with the consequences. The lights inside the mining facility began to go out one by one. In the darkness of the mining facility, something fundamental changed about the nature of the conflict. Zekthor could no longer track individual human signatures on his sensors. The 12 separate contacts had somehow merged into something else entirely, a single presence that moved through the facility like a living shadow. The Vorthak night vision was excellent, their genetic modifications allowing them to see in conditions that would blind most species, but their enhanced senses became a liability in the enclosed space of the mining tunnels. Every sound was amplified. Every movement created echoes that bounced off metal walls and crystal formations. Every breath became a potential death sentence. The humans, with their primitive equipment and unmodified biology, had somehow turned the facility into their natural habitat. Commander Velthar's tactical display showed his forces as scattered red dots throughout the complex, each one isolated and vulnerable. He had lost all coordination, all unit cohesion. His warriors were reduced to individuals stumbling through a maze designed by an enemy who understood the terrain better than they did. The first kill came from Section 7, deep in the lower mining tunnels. Warrior Prime Klex had been a veteran of 18 campaigns, a soldier whose reflexes had been honed by decades of combat. His death scream lasted exactly 3 seconds before cutting to silence. When his squad found his body, they discovered something that made their enhanced nervous systems flood with chemical terror. He had been killed with his own claws. The implications were staggering. Someone had gotten close enough to a fully armed Vorthak warrior to turn his natural weapons against him. Someone had overpowered a being bred for physical superiority and genetically enhanced for combat effectiveness. Someone had done it so quietly that his squad, positioned 30 meters away, hadn't heard anything until the death scream. But the physical impossibility wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the message carved into the metal wall beside Klex's body. Written in Vorthak script with surgical precision were the words, "You chose this. We're just finishing what you started." The psychological impact rippled through the Vorthak forces like a virus. Warriors who had never known fear began to understand what it felt like to be prey. Soldiers who had been bred for aggression found themselves jumping at shadows and hesitating before entering new sections of the facility. In Section 12, Sergeant Torres had discovered something that changed the entire dynamic of the engagement. The mining facility wasn't just a mining facility. The Vorthak had been using it as a testing ground for a new type of weapon, something they called species-specific viral agents, biological weapons designed to target the genetic markers of specific alien races, including humans. Torres's voice came across the communication frequencies with a coldness that made Zekthor's respiratory slits freeze. "Captain, you need to see this." They weren't just here for the crystals. They were planning to use this place to test weapons of mass destruction against Earth. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. When Captain Chen finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everything within 100 kilometers. "Copy that, Sergeant. Rules of engagement are now unrestricted. No survivors." Zekthor had heard those words before in other conflicts from other species, but coming from a human, they carried implications that made his diplomatic training inadequate. Other species declared no survivors as a tactical decision. Humans declared it as a promise. The change in the humans' behavior was immediate and absolute. What had been a methodical dismantling of the Vorthak forces became something else entirely. Something that Zekthor's species had no word for, but that humans called righteous fury. Private Kim's voice cut through the chaos with surgical precision. Section 4 secured. 15 targets eliminated. Moving to Section 5. Corporal Zheng's report followed seconds later. Section 9 clear. 22 confirmed kills. Evidence of biological weapon testing located and documented. The humans were no longer fighting a battle. They were conducting an execution. Commander Velthar's breathing had become ragged, his enhanced physiology struggling to process the stress chemicals flooding his system. "This is impossible. You're primitives. You have no advanced weapons, no energy shields, no combat enhancement. How are you doing this?" Captain Chen's response came from directly behind him. In the command center, where she couldn't possibly have reached without passing through 3 squads of elite guards and a dozen automated defense systems. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "You've been thinking about this all wrong. You see our lack of enhancements as a weakness. You see our primitive weapons as inferior technology. You see our small numbers as a disadvantage." Velthar spun around, his weapon raised and ready to fire. The command center was empty except for him and the bodies of his staff. Bodies that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. "But here's what you don't understand about humans," Chen's voice continued, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We don't need advanced weapons because we are the weapon. We don't need combat enhancements because we evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years. We don't need large numbers because each one of us carries the genetic memory of 10,000 generations of survivors." A single projectile punched through the command center's armored viewport, shattering crystal that should have been unbreakable. Commander Velthar dropped to the floor, his weapon skittering across the metal grating. And most importantly, Captain Chen's voice concluded, now clearly coming from the ventilation grate directly above his head, "You made this personal when you decided to build weapons to kill our children." The lights in the command center went out, and Commander Velthar finally understood what it meant to be alone in the dark, with a human who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The command center fell silent except for the steady drip of coolant from damaged systems and the rapid breathing of a Vorthak commander who had finally learned the meaning of helplessness. Zekthor watched through his diplomatic vessel's sensors as heat signatures moved through the facility with methodical precision, eliminating the last pockets of resistance. Commander Velthar was alone now. His elite force of 300 warriors had been reduced to scattered groups of terrified individuals hiding in maintenance shafts and storage compartments. The humans had accomplished in 3 hours what should have taken a full planetary assault force weeks to achieve. But it wasn't the tactical victory that shook Zekthor to his core. It was the realization that he had completely misunderstood the nature of humanity itself. Captain Chen materialized from the shadows like a ghost given form, her primitive weapon trained on the Vorthak commander's center mass. In the dim emergency lighting, she looked exactly like what she was, a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Commander Velthar," she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy of a diplomatic meeting, rather than the harsh tones of a battlefield. I believe we need to have a conversation. Velthar's enhanced physiology was designed to eliminate fear responses, but evolution had its limits. When faced with something that existed outside the parameters of normal tactical engagement, even genetically modified aggression had its breaking point. "You're going to kill me," he stated, his voice carrying the flat acceptance of inevitable death. "That depends," Chen replied, settling into a crouch that somehow managed to be both relaxed and ready for instant violence, "on whether you're smart enough to help me prevent this from happening again." The conversation that followed would later be classified at the highest levels of galactic security, but Zekthor was able to record most of it through his diplomatic monitoring systems. What he heard changed his understanding not just of humans, but of the entire galactic political structure. Chen began by displaying the evidence her team had gathered from the facility's computer systems. The biological weapons program was far more extensive than anyone had suspected. The Vorthak Empire had been developing species-specific pathogens for over 50 alien races, including every member of the Galactic Council. This facility wasn't just about testing weapons against humans, Chen explained, her tone matter-of-fact despite the enormity of what she was revealing. This was preparation for galactic genocide, selective extinction of any species that might pose a threat to Vorthak expansion. Velthar's silence was answer enough. "The question now," Chen continued, "is whether you're the kind of commander who follows orders without thinking, or the kind who understands the bigger picture. Because if you're the first type, then yes, I'm going to kill you. If you're the second type, then we might be able to work something out." What followed was a negotiation unlike anything in Zekthor's diplomatic experience. Captain Chen, a human military officer from a species barely 50 years into galactic civilization, proceeded to dictate terms to the representative of one of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful empires. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. The Vorthak Empire would immediately cease all biological weapons research. They would surrender all existing samples to a joint human galactic inspection team. They would provide full documentation of every test, every target species, and every delivery method they had developed. In exchange, the human team would allow Velthar and his surviving warriors to leave the planet alive. "You can't be serious," Velthar finally managed. "You're 12 primitives dictating terms to an empire that spans 1,000 star systems. The Council will never enforce such an agreement." Chen's smile was visible even in the dim lighting, and Zekthor finally understood why other species found human expressions so disturbing. It wasn't aggression or humor. It was confidence born from absolute certainty. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child, "you're still thinking about this wrong. You think this is about the Council or diplomatic pressure, or political agreements." She gestured around the destroyed command center, at the bodies of elite warriors who had been eliminated by primitive weapons and impossible tactics. "This is about something much simpler. It's about the fact that humans remember everything, and we never ever forgive attempted genocide. The Council doesn't need to enforce this agreement. We will." The transmission from Captain Chen to the Galactic Council emergency session was brief and to the point. She had exposed a biological weapons program that threatened every species in known space. She had documentation proving the Vorthak Empire's intent to commit galactic genocide, and she had single-handedly eliminated the threat with a team of 12 soldiers using equipment that most civilizations considered obsolete. But the most important part of her message was the final paragraph, which Zekthor would later realize was directed not at the Council members, but at every species monitoring the transmission. "Humanity has been part of the galactic community for 50 years. In that time, we've followed your rules, respected your customs, and attempted to find our place among the stars through peaceful cooperation. But let me be absolutely clear about something that I don't think has been properly understood." The pause that followed seemed to stretch across space itself. "We didn't join the galactic community because we needed protection. We joined because we thought you might need ours. Today you've seen what 12 humans can do when someone threatens our children. Tomorrow you're going to learn what 7 billion humans can do to prevent it from ever happening again." Commander Velthar's surrender was formally recorded 17 minutes later. The Vorthak Empire's biological weapons program was dismantled within 6 months, and every species in the galaxy began to understand that humanity wasn't just another member of the cosmic community. They were the guarantee that there would continue to be a cosmic community at all. 3 months after the incident at Kepler 442b, Zekthor found himself in the strangest position of his diplomatic career. He was standing in the Earth Embassy on Luna Station, waiting to attend a human military ceremony. Not as an observer or mediator, but as an honored guest. The revelation of the Vorthak biological weapons program had sent shockwaves through the galactic community that were still being felt. 7 major trade alliances had been restructured. The Galactic Council had implemented emergency protocols for monitoring weapons of mass destruction. 3 species had formally requested human military advisors to assess their defensive capabilities. But the most significant change was happening right here, in the modest human embassy that had become the unofficial center of galactic security discussions. Captain Chen entered the reception hall wearing a simple blue uniform that somehow managed to convey more authority than the elaborate ceremonial robes of most galactic dignitaries. She approached Zekthor with the same direct manner that had made him so uncomfortable during their first meeting, but now he understood what he had been seeing in her eyes. It wasn't aggression or arrogance, it was responsibility. The weight of knowing that sometimes the survival of entire civilizations came down to the choices made by a few individuals in impossible circumstances. "Ambassador," she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting that Zekthor had learned to appreciate. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't the kind of ceremony you're used to." She was right. Human military ceremonies were unlike anything in Zekthor's experience. There were no elaborate displays of wealth or power, no demonstrations of advanced technology or genetic superiority. Just individuals in simple uniforms acknowledging the actions of their peers with quiet dignity. The 12 members of the Kepler 442b mission stood at attention while their commanding officer read a citation that focused not on their tactical brilliance or combat effectiveness, but on their adherence to human values under extreme circumstances. The values that had prevented them from simply eliminating the Vorthak force from orbit, and instead risking their own lives to gather evidence of the biological weapons program. Their actions, the citation concluded, exemplify the fundamental human principle that the protection of life extends beyond our own species to encompass all sentient beings who share our common desire for survival and dignity. Zekthor had read thousands of military citations from dozens of different species, most focused on glory, honor, or the defeat of enemies. This was the first one he had encountered that emphasized the preservation of life as the highest military virtue. After the ceremony, Captain Chen invited him to her office for a private conversation. The space was small and functional, decorated only with a few pictures of Earth and what appeared to be personal photographs of the team members with their families. "I've been reading your reports to the Council," Chen began, settling behind a desk that was probably older than some of the diplomatic vessels in the station's docking bays. "You've been trying to understand what happened down there. What made it possible for 12 humans to accomplish what should have required a full battle fleet?" Zekthor's forearms gestured in the complex pattern his species used to express profound confusion. "I have reviewed the tactical data countless times. By every principle of military science, your mission should have failed. Your casualties should have been absolute. Yet you achieved complete victory with 0 losses." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And you want to know if this represents some new human military capability that threatens the balance of galactic power?" The directness of her statement caught Zekthor off guard, but he appreciated the honesty. "The Council is concerned. Several species have formally requested assessments of human military potential. There are rumors that Earth possesses weapons technology far beyond what has been publicly revealed." "They're right," Chen said simply. "We do possess weapons technology beyond what most species understand, but it's not what they think it is." She stood and walked to the small viewport that looked out on the stark lunar landscape. "Ambassador, can I ask you a personal question? In your 3 centuries of diplomatic service, how many wars have you seen?" 17 major conflicts, Zekthor replied automatically, including the Zephyrian Civil War, the Mantid expansion, and the... How many of those wars were fought by choice? The question stopped Zekthor mid-sentence. He considered the conflicts he had witnessed, the negotiations he had attempted, the species he had watched rise and fall. I'm not certain I understand the distinction. Every species you've encountered fights wars for resources, territory, ideology, or survival. Those are all choices, even when they feel inevitable. Humans are different. We don't fight wars because we choose to. We fight wars because someone else chooses to force us to. Chen turned back to face him, and once again Zekthor found himself looking into those unsettling human eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. The weapon that won the battle at Kepler 442b wasn't advanced technology or genetic enhancement. It was something much older and much more dangerous. It was the absolute certainty that we were fighting for something more important than our own lives. She pulled up a holographic display showing the battle footage from Kepler 442b. 12. Small figures moving across a landscape of impossible odds with coordination that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Every member of that team knew they were probably going to die down there. They also knew that if they failed, the Vorthak biological weapons would eventually be used against not just humans, but every species in the galaxy. So they made a choice that most species would consider irrational. What choice? They decided that preventing genocide was worth any personal cost. That's the human weapons technology that everyone's so worried about, Ambassador. We're willing to pay prices that other species consider unthinkable to protect principles that other species consider abstract. Zekthor was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that reached far beyond military tactics or diplomatic strategies. And this is why the Council should not fear humanity? Chen's smile was gentle now, lacking the predatory edge he had observed during the battle. The Council should absolutely fear us, Ambassador, but not because we're a threat to galactic civilization. They should fear us because we're the species that will do whatever it takes to preserve it. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics that would shape galactic policy for decades to come. But the moment that stayed with Zekthor was the realization that he had finally understood what courage actually looked like. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear when something more important than personal safety was at stake. 2 years later, Zekthor stood before the Galactic Council Emergency Assembly, preparing to deliver the most important testimony of his career. The chamber was packed with representatives from over 200 species, all waiting to hear his final assessment of what had become known as the human question. The events at Kepler 442b had been the catalyst, but they were no longer the main concern. In the months following the exposure of the Vorthak biological weapons program, humanity had quietly but decisively emerged as the galaxy's de facto peacekeeping force, not through conquest or political maneuvering, but through a series of interventions that had prevented conflicts before they could escalate into wars. The Mantid crystalline border dispute had been resolved when human negotiators convinced both species that their territorial claims were based on falsified historical data planted by weapons, merchants looking to profit from the conflict. The Zephyrian food crisis had ended when human agricultural specialists introduced farming techniques that increased crop yields by 300%. The Vorthon succession crisis had been peacefully settled when human mediators helped establish a new governmental structure that satisfied all competing factions. Each intervention had been successful. Each had prevented massive loss of life, and each had demonstrated that humans possess something far more dangerous than advanced weapons or superior tactics. They possessed the ability to make other species want to be better than they were. Distinguished representatives, Zekthor began, his voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of 3 centuries of diplomatic experience. You have asked me to provide a comprehensive assessment of humanity's role in galactic affairs. You want to know whether they represent a threat to the established order, whether their military capabilities exceed acceptable parameters, and whether the Council should take steps to limit their influence. The chamber was absolutely silent. Every species in known space had a stake in this assessment. The wrong decision could trigger conflicts that would make the old wars seem like minor disagreements. I have spent 2 years studying human behavior, analyzing their military capabilities, and observing their interactions with other species. My conclusion is simple. Humanity is indeed a threat to the established order. They are a threat to the assumption that intelligent species must choose between strength and compassion. They are a threat to the belief that advanced civilizations inevitably become corrupt and self-serving. They are a threat to the idea that peace is maintained through balance of power rather than balance of principles. Murmurs of concern rippled through the assembly. Several representatives began activating their communication devices, preparing to contact their home governments with warnings about human expansion. But, Sektor continued, his voice cutting through the rising tension, they are not a threat to any species that shares their commitment to the preservation of life and the protection of the innocent. In fact, for such species, humanity represents the greatest hope for long-term survival that the galaxy has ever seen. He activated the holographic display system, showing footage from dozens of human interventions across known space. Small teams of humans working alongside alien specialists to solve problems that had seemed intractable. Human negotiators finding common ground between species that had been enemies for centuries. Human scientists sharing technological advances freely, without demanding territorial concessions or economic advantages. The question before this council is not whether humanity poses a threat. The question is whether we are wise enough to accept the partnership they are offering. Ambassador Velthar, the former Vorthak commander who had surrendered at Kepler 442b, stood to address the assembly. His presence was a reminder that even the galaxy's most aggressive military forces had learned to respect human capabilities. Honored representatives, he said, his translated voice carrying undertones of hard-earned wisdom. I have the unique perspective of having faced humans in combat and survived to learn from the experience. What I discovered on that planet was not superior technology or advanced tactics. What I discovered was a species that fights harder for other people's children than most species fight for their own. His words carried weight that no amount of tactical analysis could provide. Here was a warrior who had experienced human combat effectiveness firsthand, testifying not about their weapons or their strategies, but about their motivations. The Vorthak Empire spent centuries building weapons designed to eliminate potential threats before they could challenge our dominance. Humans spent those same centuries building institutions designed to help other species achieve their full potential. We created tools for destruction. They created tools for cooperation. The results speak for themselves. Captain Chen was present in the gallery, representing Earth's interests as an observer rather than a participant. She had requested permission to address the council only if directly questioned, preferring to let the evidence speak for itself. When Council Chairman Mordek finally called upon her, her statement was characteristically brief and direct. Honored representatives, my species has a saying, judge us not by our capacity for war, but by our willingness to prevent it. We have shown you what we can do when forced to fight. Now we ask for the opportunity to show you what we can build when allowed to cooperate. The final vote was closer than many had expected, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Species after species stood to announce their support for expanded human participation in galactic affairs, not because they feared human military power, but because they had come to understand that human principles aligned with their own deepest values. The formal resolution established humanity as the galaxy's official mediator for interspecies conflicts, with the authority to intervene in disputes that threatened civilian populations. It also created joint human-alien research initiatives focused on solving the fundamental problems that drove most galactic conflicts: resource scarcity, territorial disputes, and technological inequality. But the most significant outcome was not recorded in any official document. It was the recognition, shared by species across the galaxy, that they had encountered something unprecedented in cosmic history. A species that had achieved interstellar capability without losing its commitment to protecting the vulnerable. As the assembly concluded and representatives began departing for their home systems, Sektor found himself thinking about the moment that had changed his entire understanding of courage. Standing on the observation deck of a neutral station, watching 12 humans prepare to face impossible odds for principles they considered more important than their own lives. He had learned that day that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear when something more important than personal safety was at stake. What he had discovered in the months since was that humanity had somehow managed to build an entire civilization around that principle. They had shown the galaxy what it looked like when courage became not just an individual virtue, but a species-wide commitment to the protection of all sentient life. And in doing so, they had given every other species in known space a choice: continue the ancient patterns of competition and conflict, or learn to build something better together. Most chose to build something better. That, Sekthor realized, was the most human thing of all.